The Historical Society of Ottawa acknowledges that as we share these stories from our past, we are on what remains the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode. This series is a collaboration between the Historical Society of Ottawa and Rogers TV. I'm Ben Weiss. I'm with the Historical Society of Ottawa, where we've been telling Ottawa's great stories since 1898. If you find Ottawa's history as fascinating as we do, I urge you to check out our website, our monthly speaker series, and follow us on Facebook, and enjoy today's segment.
Hello, my name is Phil Gurski. I am a retired intelligence analyst, having spent more than 3 decades with Communications Security Establishment, as well as the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And more importantly, for the purposes of today's talk, I was a counterterrorism analyst with CSIS from 2001 until 2015, and I'm the author of 6 books on terrorism. And I'm here today to talk about the latest book, which is coming out in the spring of 2026, that has a very definitive link to Ottawa, and that's the Fenian Threat to Canada in the mid-1860s. Now, some of you may have heard of the Fenians. They were essentially Irish Americans who wanted to use Canada as a staging ground to invade, to put pressure on Britain to grant independence to the Republic of Ireland. They were a movement that began in Ireland in the 1840s, but because the British police had essentially infiltrated them with human sources, knew what they were doing, a lot of them fled to North America, large United States, and they were helped in large part by the vast Irish immigration post-potato famine in the 1840s. The reason why this topic is of interest to me is that there was a gap in the literature when it came to the Fenian threat to Canada. A lot's been written about it. The famous Battle of Ridgeway in 1866, the threat to Toronto in the same year, very incipient raids into Quebec and New Brunswick in the same time period. But not a lot's been written about the threat to Eastern Ontario and, by extension, Ottawa in the middle of the 1860s. The reason why I got onto this topic was really twofold. In 2020, I moved from my home in Ottawa to Russell, Ontario. Got involved with a local historical society, the Russell and District Historical Society. And while perusing the collection one day, I came across this black and white photo dated from 1869. And it was 2 young men dressed resplendently in militia uniform. They were the Hamilton brothers, from a long-standing family in the area. And the caption said, "The Hamilton boys, part of the Duncanville, Company Number 8, in 1869, that was struck to fight the Fenians." And I began to ask myself, why would Duncanville, which was the earlier name for Russell, have a company to fight the Fenians? Russell is an hour north of the border. It's an hour north of Prescott. How could Russell/Duncanville be the site of a Fenian threat? The second reason why I wanted to look into the Fenian threat of the 1860s is, given I'm a counterterrorism specialist and have written books on the topic, I wanted to look at whether the Fenians could now be construed as a terrorist threat to Canada in that time period. Terrorism is a more modern term. We didn't talk about terrorism in the 19th century, and it's always dangerous to look at history through hindsight of course being 2020. But I wanted to look at the actual threat the Fenians posed to Canada and whether or not they would construe a terrorist group as we understand the term right now. So my research program took me a lot into old archives, libraries across Eastern Ontario, the Ottawa Room here in Central Ottawa at the main library, digitized newspapers. I had great access to. The state of New York has digitized all their newspapers from the 1840s onwards. I had full free access to articles from dozens of newspapers in New York State for the given time period. And here in Ottawa, we had the Ottawa Citizen and Journal who've been digitized. Unfortunately, not so much from the local papers like in Morrisburg and Prescott and Brockville and Cornwall, bits and pieces here and there. But after a long research process, I began to get a feel for how this threat was perceived in the 1860s. So again, the Fenians were largely Irish Americans. They had come to the United States from Ireland. They had created a society, what they called the Fenians, and their goal was to pressure Britain to grant Ireland independence. And because their efforts had failed in Britain, they decided to sort of transfer their goal to North America. Now, by the mid-1860s, the Fenians had been around for a decade or so. They raised some money, they created some chapters, not a lot going on, but then the US Civil War ended. And of course, you had hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were dismissed from active duty, armed, battle-hardened, many of them Irish Americans. And the Fenians thought, this is great. We have all these guys who fought a civil war. We're going to use them to invade Canada. Similarly, at the same time, the Canadian government was well aware that these Irish Americans were making these noises in places like Philadelphia, in Boston, in New York, in Cleveland, as far west as Chicago and St. Louis. And the government of Sir John A. Macdonald actually created an intelligence service, the Dominion Police Service, to infiltrate the Fenians in the 1860s. So both sides sort of had their plans made. Now I want to look at what was the actual nature of the Fenian threat. So the Fenians claimed to have hundreds of thousands of members and millions of dollars in the bank, both of which were vast exaggerations at the time. And one thing that I found fascinating in my research program was how the Fenians were viewed by locals on both sides of the border. And I was able to use the aforementioned digitized newspapers to gain a sense as to how locals in Canada, in upper state New York, looked at the Fenians, what they thought of them, whether they supported them. And so I'll look a little bit about what I found from those newspaper reports. So first on the American side, thousands of articles were written on the Fenians from 1865 to 1870 in the newspapers of upper state New York. There's 4 counties that border the Canadian border between kind of Brockville and Cornwall. And the overarching theme of these papers that viewed the Fenians, and these are very large Irish American populations, about 40% of the population in those northern counties was probably of Irish heritage. And yet the newspapers of the time would often lead their articles with Fenian fools or Fenian fiasco. And so it became quite clear to me that there wasn't a lot of sympathy for the Fenian movement. They referred, for example, to the failed Fenian raid in Campobello Island in New Brunswick in 1865 as this grand fiasco that went nowhere. And so you had this making fun of the Fenians. They would report on what's happening both back in England and Ireland, as well as what's happening in the Eastern Seaboard and in the aforementioned New York and Boston, but they'd cover stories locally as well about how arms caches have been found and how the Fenians would have picnics to raise money to bolster their cause to cross the border into Canada. Interestingly, in late May and early June of 1866, the Fenians actually pulled it off. They actually invaded Canada across the Niagara River at Buffalo. They basically burned Fort Erie to the ground, and they met British and Canadian militia at Ridgeway, outside of modern St. Catharines. Battle was fought, several dozen wounded and killed on both sides, and the Fenians fled back to the United States, and New York newspapers were aghast at this Fenian success, because these guys thought they couldn't organize a drunk up in a bar. And yet here they had crossed the Canadian border, engaged the British in a battle, killed some British and Canadian militia soldiers, and claimed a victory of sorts. But shortly after the Battle of Ridgeway, the newspaper coverage went back to the same old, the Fenians are a waste of time, they shouldn't receive support. On the Canadian side, what was interesting was there were kind of 2 ways the Canadian newspapers, and again, limited access because not a lot of digitized papers from the time, but there were 2 things that were, I think, quite major themes in newspapers at the time. One was the pride at Canadians volunteering for militia. There were thousands of Canadians from hamlets such as Duncanville, from Almont, from Pakenham, from Martinburg, from you name it, all across Eastern Ontario. These men would sign up as volunteer militia, and when they were deployed, they got 25 cents a day, and they would often be sent down to the St. Lawrence River, which was believed to be the most natural crossing point for the Fenians, because A, this is before the St. Lawrence Seaway was built. The river was only tens of meters across, and their belief was that they were going to attack either Prescott, Brockville, or Cornwall, which were both essentially minutes away from the US border. And whenever the alarm went out, there were rumors, either through intelligence or rumor mongering, that the Fenians would cross the river. These militias would get in on trains. There were a couple of trains that were running at the time, down to the Seaway. They would protect canals, they would protect the riverfront, they would protect banks, they would protect government buildings, all in the possibility the Fenians would cross the river. In actual fact, they never did once. Between Brockville and Cornwall, there was not one single successful crossing by the Fenians, despite the scare at the time. But the local papers really, they commended these young men for doing what they were doing. The second sort of major theme in the Canadian papers was that the Fenian threat was real. And the government of Sir John A. Macdonald, of course, one of his close allies was Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who was assassinated by the Fenian sympathizer in 1868, took the threat very seriously. And this is why they created the Militia Act to raise more militias across the province to deal with the possibility of the Fenians. But at the end of the day, it didn't amount to anything at all. There's a fascinating mural at the Brockville Museum about the Fenians crossing the St. Lawrence. It's a fictitious mural because it never happened. And yet there was this constant fear, because what the Fenians wanted to do was cross the river, and they would seize the Grand Trunk Railroad, which ran from Montreal to Toronto. And that would do two things. That would interrupt trade and travel between the 2 points. It'd also sever the telegraph lines, and therefore they could essentially control the information path. So the Canadian government, under Sir John A., was very, very aware of this threat and very much ready to meet the possibility that the Fenians would do this. So in the end, why weren't the Fenians successful? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First and foremost, they thought they had the support of Irish Catholics in Canada. And in fact, there were some Fenian sympathizers in Toronto largely, large Irish population. One of the greatest scares in 1866 was the St. Patrick's Day, where they thought the Fenian sympathizers would rise up and engage in battle against the Orange Order, which of course is the Protestants in Toronto. And there were some guys had probably a few too many whiskeys, and there were a couple of, fist fights here and there, but nothing amounted to much. In actual fact, there was very little sympathy amongst Irish Catholics for the Fenian cause. Secondly, the Fenians also thought that they had French Catholic support in Canada, because they felt, well, the French are like us, they're Catholics. They don't like the British like we don't like the British, and ergo, they'll be on our side. In actual fact, the French Catholics wanted nothing to do with the Fenians. And the Catholic Church in general also essentially excommunicated the Fenians as being anti-Christian for their use of arms. So there were bishops in St. Louis and Cincinnati that issued statements saying, we do not support the Fenian cause. The second big mistake that the Fenians made is that they thought they had the support of the US government under President Johnson after Lincoln's assassination in 1865. And they reported that they had met with Johnson and he had said he would recognize facts on the ground. They took that to mean that if they do something successful in Canada, Johnson would support them with arms and or money. When in actual fact, after the Battle of Bridgeway, when the Fenians went back over the Niagara River, Johnson had them all arrested and had all of their arms confiscated. Largely, in fact, because the United States and the United Kingdom had a Neutrality Act dating from the late 18th century, which meant that neither country could be used in military action against the other. So the Johnson administration had no time for the Fenians and essentially did not support their cause. When push came to shove, the Fenian threat ended up being a non-threat. A lot of bluster. The money they claimed they had, they didn't have. The support they claimed they had, they didn't have. The last Fenian incursion or semi-incursion into Canada dates from 1870 when they tried to cross the border into what was then Rupert's Land, now the province of Manitoba, seized what they thought was the Hudson's Bay Company post. They were probably on the US side of the border at the time. So 30 Fenians, that was the last Fenian gasp in 1870. It could have been much different though. So in the book that I've written, which is titled The Fenians, Brotherhood of Fools, or Canada's First Terrorist Threat, to come out in the spring by Double Dagger Press out of New Brunswick, I look at some possible scenarios. What if the US government had in fact supported the Fenians? Could have been a very different outcome. What if the sympathy in Canada had been larger than as the Fenians thought it was amongst Irish Catholics and French Catholics? They could have created a fifth column here in the country as well. What if the Macdonald government hadn't seen the Fenian threat as serious and hadn't raised the militia? Again, there were very few incursions, but if the Fenians felt that there was no Canadian opponent on the other side of the river, they may have been more emboldened to do so. And yet thousands of people, as I mentioned, did volunteer to go to the riverfront in the event of a possible Fenian invasion. So a lot of what ifs, but in the end, what could have been a very dangerous time for Canadian nationality, for our very independence as a nation, turned out to be a lot of basically bluster and a lot of false claims of success. Now to turn to the question of terrorism, which is something that, again, I worked in counterterrorism for a long time. And so I basically asked myself the question, were the Fenians terrorists? So just as a bit of a segue, under Canadian law, terrorism is the use of extreme violence to further political, ideological, or religious ends. That's out of the Canadian Criminal Code, the Anti-Terrorism Act, which was passed after 9/11. Look at the Fenians. They were most definitely a group that used violence for political ends, i.e. the independence of Ireland from England. So they met the definition of a terrorist group even way back in 1865. Furthermore, one of the other names that the Fenians used to describe themselves was, get ready for it, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. Where do we know them from? Well, of course, the IRA, which was created after the Easter Uprising in 1916 in Ireland, became one of the most lethal terrorist groups in the 1960s and 70s. You all remember the Troubles in Northern Ireland and in the north of the Republic in the late 60s, early 70s. In essence, the Fenian Brotherhood was the precursor to the IRA. And as a consequence, based on my own professional experience, I would say that in fact the Fenians were a terrorist group in the mid of the 1860s, despite the fact that the word terrorism was not widely used, although I did find one quote from a British newspaper in the 1860s that referred to the Fenians as terrorists. Perhaps one of the first uses of the word terrorism in the English language. A bigger question for me too is, what did the Fenian threat mean to Canada? Well, it meant a couple of things. We as a nation realized by the 1850s that we had to have our own armed forces. The British had largely been the defenders of Canada since the British came over centuries ago. The British were withdrawing their force from Canada to meet other battles across the world, for example, the Crimean War in the 1850s. And as a consequence, Canada had to have its own standing army. The Fenian threat was a good excuse to make the case that Canada needed a permanent force, even if it was a volunteer force. This is why you had militias and companies created all across the provinces of Ontario and Quebec. The other interesting part about the Fenian threat is the impact it had on Confederation. So of course, by 1864, you have the various conferences talking about Confederation, which was originally Canada West, now Ontario, Canada East, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And there were negotiations going back and forth. The two Canadas were for Confederation. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, not so much. They wanted to remain an independent, or rather colonies of Great Britain. And yet when the Fenians tried to take Campobello Island between Maine and New Brunswick in the spring of 1865, the New Brunswick government realized we can't do this on our own. Now that threat was pushed back by a combination of Canadian and British militia, but the New Brunswick government thought, if we're part of a greater polity, i.e. a confederated country under 4 provinces, we might be in a better position to actually fend off the Fenian threat. Nova Scotia felt the same way, and as a consequence, we all know what happened on July the 1st of 1867. Canada became an independent country, initially with the first 4 provinces. And I'm not the only person to argue that one of the contributing factors to Confederation was in fact the Fenian threat. And I also look at, the role the Fenians had in defining Canadian nationhood. And here I go on a little bit of shakier ground, but we often see the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917 as the founding of Canadian nationhood. This was the first time where 4 Canadian divisions fought together. They took Vimy Ridge, which many of the Allies had failed in the years previous to that. And Vimy Ridge, many of us have visited the Grand Memorial there that commemorates the thousands of Canadians who died taking that ridge. And we see that as a very seminal moment in Canadian history, where our military fought, under our flag and achieved victory. I'm going to argue that, in fact, Canadian nationhood was founded 50 years earlier, during the Fenian threat, when these volunteer militia from these tiny hamlets made great sacrifices to leave their families, leave their farm, leave their businesses on a moment's notice, spend a couple of weeks in Prescott or Brockville or Cornwall, get there by ox cart, by horse, by train, by marching, whatever, to defend their newfound land against a threat from the American neighbors. And to me, that's one of the definitions of nationhood, is where you take enough pride in what you've established to want to fight for it, to want to defend it. So I'm not dismissing the importance of Vimy Ridge. I'm just saying that, when you combine Confederation with the Fenian threat, with this sense of we need to defend our new land from the possibility of incursion from the south, that was a major contribution to Canadian nationhood. Looking back now, 150 years later, the Fenian Threat is a mere footnote in Canadian history. I don't recall ever reading about it or being taught about it either in high school or university when I took Canadian history. That's changing now, apparently. There's now a teacher's aid on the Fenian Threat of the 1860s, which I'm glad to finally see happening. But it's one of these parts of our history that I think we as Canadians just ignore. And I'm not really sure why we do that. You look at Ottawa, for example. Ottawa had regular patrols outside of banks and outside of government offices on the fear the Fenians would eventually enter Ottawa. That was their grand plan, was of course to take the capital. Originally was to take Montreal, which of course was the financial capital of Canada in the 1860s, but their plan was to take Ottawa and use that as a bargaining chip against Britain. Hence you had a large militia force in Ottawa for many, many years after that, a large Irish population in Ottawa. And the fear was they were sympathizers amongst the Irish for the Fenian cause. And then perhaps most importantly, you had the first terrorist attack in our history occurred in April of 1868 when Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who left Parliament building that night after a long debate, maybe had a few drinks with friends of his, was going to his rooming house on Spark Street when two men came up and fatally shot him. Patrick Joseph Whalen was eventually arrested and accused of the assassination. Whether or not he did is a sort of a question mark to this day, but he was tried, found guilty, and hanged in the Ottawa jail, and he was a known Fenian sympathizer. So despite the fact that the Fenians never achieved much, with the exception of the Battle of Ridgeway and the assassination of T.D. McGee, they were a very real threat to Canadian sovereignty in the 1860s. And the Canadian government at the time treated it as it had to, as a real threat. In hindsight, we can say, well, the Fenians couldn't organize a piss up in a bar, and therefore we wasted resources doing it. But that's hindsight. The Macdonald government did what it needed to do, what it believed it had to do to protect Canada against this threat. It was a real threat, even though we look back now and we see it as being rather minor in nature, but it did dominate the headlines of the time. When I went back through newspapers, both here in Canada and the United States, there were thousands and thousands of articles in the Fenians. I couldn't go by a single day in New York newspapers and not find an article on the Fenians. That's how dominant the theme was back then. End of the day, Ireland did achieve its independence, of course, in, I believe, 1921 from England. So the Fenian cause maybe at some point did have some kind of effect in setting the ground for Irish independence. But it's a fascinating period in Canadian history. It is part of the Irish immigration experience to our lands. We have here in Ottawa, we have the memorial to the Irish famine, just nearby here in Beechwood Cemetery. We have, of course, the large contribution that Irish Canadians have made to our history and to our culture. And the other thing I think that's really important is that this was one more occasion on which we had a threat coming to us from our American neighbors. Of course, we all know about the War of 1812. That was an American aggression. We had an infamous raid just outside of Prescott, the Battle of the Windmill in 1837, which was linked to the Upper Canada Rebellion at the time, another fiasco by the Americans. We had the Fenian Threat, and now I'm giving this talk in October of 2025, and we have a neighbor to the south that wants to make us the 51st state. So I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's kind of this, I think, a bit of shed a bit of light, I think, on our troubled relationship with our neighbors to the south. We're the best of allies. We fought wars together. We trade together. We intermarry. We have friends on both sides. We travel to each other's lands. And yet on several occasions, Canada has had to stand up for itself against aggression from the United States. I'm hoping that we don't see a repeat of this aggression under the Trump administration, although that remains to be seen. But to me, as an amateur historian, as somebody who worked in counterterrorism, who loves talking about Canadian history and, more importantly, local history. I'm currently the president of the Russell and District Historical Society. These are stories that our kids and our grandkids have to know about. This is where we come from. This is the things that happened to our country. These are the measures and moves that people took to protect Canadian sovereignty. And I think that we don't recall these stories and we relegate them to the dusty shelves, bookshelves. I think we're doing ourselves a great disservice. So in closing, the Fenian Threat to Canada, lasted the better part of about 5 years, from 1865 to 1870. It was more bluster than actual threat, but it did help in the creation of a new Canada. It helped in the creation of the Canadian military, and it helped instill a sense of nationhood and pride and patriotism that Canada could muster in the face of an external threat. And it's a part of our history that I think we have to pass on, because it's just part of who we are as Canadians. So I'd like to thank you for listening to my little bit on the Fenians. Again, the book is The Fenians, A Brotherhood of Fools, or Canada's First Terrorist Threat, to come out from Double Dagger Press in the spring of 2026. Thanks for your time.